Greetings, programs, pawns and poppers, us, one and all. We've grown a weep ninny to those of you who get the reference. I am here once again with my second live stream, a slightly different setup here. Not talking about Deepwell Ink Entertainment as a whole, but specifically about the FARAD system, and giving a little discussion about what that is and going in depth into some of the information about the system itself. So, what is the FARAD system? It is an abbreviation for the Fully Adaptable Roleplay Adventure Design System. It is a universal modular toolbox, primarily with rollover dice pools, dice stairs, and metacurrencies. Metacurrencies primarily in the form of specific dice that can be added onto rolls. There are some other ones that are in optional mechanics for those who would like to utilize those, and some which are more or less the standard fare that is seen in a lot of tabletop role-playing games, such as luck points, which don't change the dynamic plot until after they are either added or not added to a roll. They aren't retroactively changing anything or introducing new elements that aren't present any more than not using them does. It just affects the odds in a way of adding the ability to take more risks, but at using that resource up as it is happening. So, the FARAD system may be run with any number of players and an arbiter. An arbiter being the one who adjudicates different rollings within the game. They are not what many would call a game master by typical tradition, simply because I do not like the term game master as it is used in common parlance. Many tend to view a game master as somebody who is in control of the adventure, when in fact it is the entire group who is in control of it. Without the players present, there is no adventure to run unless the arbiter chooses to run a solo mode adventure, which, granted, is feasible within the FARAD system. But without the arbiter, the players don't have as much of a grasp on how to shape the dynamic plot through use of mechanics unless they have specifically taken the time to read through those particular parts of how to shape adventures. For many people, this is not something that they want to do, whether they have played the particular system that they're playing a game in or not. Many tabletop role-playing games are designed for jumping in with very rules-light systems, and ones that are far more mechanical and crunchy in nature tend to be those that lean toward a more experienced mindset within the hobby, or those who are drawn to such mechanical layers rather than those who have not experienced tabletop role-playing games in the past at all. The FARAD system can be run with sharing arbitration between all the players in the group, or having a single individual who is managing that aspect. And as much as possible, the FARAD system is designed to allow it to be rotated without having difficulty in keeping certain elements hidden from players. If it is something that they do not know about upcoming plot, for example, but a player's entity ends up dying in a particular adventure session, it is feasible for them to be able to take over for some of the hostile entities that the rest of the group is playing against, and be able to run them uh, by and large without even needing to know what uh, capabilities that entity has in full. They don't need to necessarily know all the plot details, all the scene elements that can be altered. They can simply be able to recognize what things cause advantage and disadvantage to the players and utilize that to say what they are choosing to do with the entity that they have taken over. In addition, unlike some systems where death is the end of a character, or some systems where death is a hiatus until a character is resurrected, the FARAD system by default doesn't force players to cease playing once their entity has perished. It has a particular mechanic in place, set of mechanics based around the same elements, wherein their entity is become spectral in nature. And if these mechanics are in use and not disabled through options to not go into those elements, then that entity can still impact things in a limited fashion, but they are at greater risk because if they are destroyed in that spectral form, rather than hiding and trying to recover themselves, then it is feasible for their soul to be shattered, in which case then there is no way of bringing them back as they were, only fragments that are not the full scope of what they had been. Bit easier if, like liches in some systems, you put away a piece of yourself ahead of time, but not necessarily needed in every aspect. Somebody might find a fragment and bring back what they can, and then try to help them remember things that they once knew, people and events that had happened, for example. One moment. Hydrate or dihydrate, everyone. So, the FARAD system is built around a non-binary 6-resolution state core. Whenever something is attempted in the FARAD system, there are 6 outcomes to what might happen. And each of these 6 outcomes might have different possibilities for how it's expanded further, but at minimum, these are the 6 that it is built around. When somebody tries to do something, say climbing up a cliff, they can have these 6 options happen. They can have a straight success happen where they climb up it and it happens just at the pace that they need it to in order to reach the top. They could have a success at cost where they end up climbing, but as they slip momentarily, an item falls off the side of their bag and they drop it, and they still are able to climb to the top, but to do so would be giving up that item to do so. They could have a success with bonus, where when they are climbing, they end up finding something that was hidden in a crevice along the way, something left by another adventurer who had previously come that route, or perhaps some medicinal herbs or creatures that are on the side of the crevice which they have ascended. They could have a straight failure where They try to climb it, and they can't climb it in the spot that they are trying to climb. This could mean that they need to find a different route up to their destination. It can mean that they need to try a different avenue other than climbing for a long stretch. It could mean that if they are chasing after an individual and they can't climb up it, that individual has advanced further and they will be significantly delayed in pursuing. They could have a failure at bonus where, well, they did manage to climb the cliff and they did manage to do so for a distance, but they managed to become stuck at a certain point where they did find something that was left by an adventurer or those other options, but they aren't able to make it to the top of the cliff. So instead they have to move to the side and find a different route. They can't go straight up. They could also have a failure at cost. They could try climbing that cliff, and as they climb, their hands could slip, could fall to the ground, and one of their items might be fragile that's in their bag, and they might land on their pack, causing it to break. That's granted if they choose to do that with one of the optional mechanics to allow something else to happen, such as breaking an item, rather than taking on a mark. Now, a mark, on the other hand, is one of the 7 penalties that can happen with the 6 resolution states. So, for example, if an entity ends up falling from the cliff like that, anything that is an at cost could mean that that entity takes on a mark. Marks add up every 2 to one of the other types of penalties if you're using 2 marks as the maximum. Now, the FARAD system being flexible as it is, you can instead choose to have more marks. You could set as a group consensus through session 0 to have, say, 5 marks as your maximum cap for that particular penalty. Once you obtain 5 marks, then whatever you were trying to avoid when you got that 5th mark, it becomes that particular penalty instead. So you fall off the cliff, and instead of taking a 6th mark, you would take a wound, and your current marks would clear. In this particular fashion, rolling over like that, marks still add up, but they aren't as immediately punishing as the other penalties may be. Now, if it's a straight failure, and someone were to have been climbing up the cliff and fallen off, they could, if they choose to, rather than simply losing time, they could choose to just simply take the penalty as a whole and take a wound from that fall, and then manage to move onward and climb in a different section, and it slowed them down, but they still were able to progress the adventure after that point. Checks in the FARAD system are specifically supposed to be used when something in the environment or with another entity has the potential for consequences to happen. Choosing to find another location to climb up a hill, for example, is going to be easier if you move onward to an area where it's not as steep. There's not particularly any consequence to doing that other than the extra time it takes. But choosing to take on the danger of climbing directly through a much more steep area would require a check versus simply allowing more time to pass. Now, the penalties are as follows. There is exhaustion and strain, which are both protected against by stamina. there is wounds and quietus, which are both protected against by essence. And there's breakdown and fixation, which are both protected against by acuity. Marks, being the seventh penalty, don't get protected by any specific statistic. Marks are simply what adds up if meeting an at cost rather than a straight failure as is. A failure at cost could have both the wound and the mark happen, whereas a failure at bonus wouldn't. It would just simply have the wound, but there'd be something positive to happen. A success at cost might have the mark happen, but it wouldn't have the wound happen, because that is more than just at cost. That is a failure that has happened and been penalized. Stamina, essence, and acuity are all the three statistics. Statistics are specifically used when resisting things that are happening in the environment, when trying to avoid freezing out in the cold, when trying to avoid becoming exhausted when going on a forced march. Stamina, resisting against exhaustion in that particular case, but it also can be resisting against strain, which is more affecting the emotional state as a result of that fatigue. With wounds, they are fairly straightforward. They are injuries that have happened to the body that are noticeable in a fashion. They can be, technically, if an entity wishes a player wishes to have it as something that's more concealed, they could be, say, internal bleeding rather than outward bleeding or heavy bruising. They could be a cracked rib that has heavy bruising, but no outward bleeding present for somebody else to notice. But they do add up to eventually an entity passing away if wounds keep accruing and are not dealt with. Unlike some games which utilize health points as a broad, ambiguous sort of track, wounds are something that is specifically meant to be either noticed or felt by the player entity within the scope of the adventure itself. Wounds can be something that another entity notices and tries to help them with their recovery, but they are not simply a matter of failing to avoid damage and having it wash away the moment that they rest. Now, there are recovery periods which can help with healing things back up slowly, but they are not a guarantee, unlike, say, for example, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, where healing for a long rest will patch you up just fine. Instead, different skills and abilities can help with guaranteeing more are taken off, but it is a more gradual process unless optional mechanics are in use that speed that along. By default, it's designed to be more of a risk because the motto of the FARAD system is play your way. If you choose to play in a fashion where it wears off faster, there are means to do so. By default, it supports a medium between being an immediate death if you take one significant wound and having 100 health points or the like. However, the maximum number of wounds is adjusted by the group at session 0 or later consensus. The arbiter, of course, typically will be somebody who has experienced multiple different tabletop role-playing games, or at least one other game or the FARAD system itself, enough to have an idea of things to suggest based off of the options that are present. However, as with any tabletop role-playing game, every group plays differently. Some add homebrew that they've created, some add third-party resources, some play only by official product. That is perfectly fine. I'm not going to tell anybody how to play specifically. It is, as I said with the motto, play your way. The system's just meant to be there to help adapt to how you wish to do that. Now, quietus is also protected by the essence statistic. Quietus is the fragments of a soul or core, core being a Irish term for a soul, technically, C-O-R. However, it also is utilized in some Irish myth with things that aren't human, that are said to have a soul. And in which case, within the FARAD system, it is specifically more referring to things that aren't sophont. They are not of human level or higher intelligence and ability to feel emotions and communicate with one another and with other species. If, say, for example, there is a player who has chosen to play a cat as their entity, and yes, the FARAD system does allow playing more than just bipedal humanoid species. They may have core rather than a soul, but they still have quietus for the fragments of that which they hopefully protect instead of having shatter if their physical body passes away. There are certain abilities and sources that also might draw upon that, just as there are some that draw upon wounds or upon fixation and breakdown. But specifically, quietus is of greater risk than the other penalties, simply because once you cap out on that, unless somebody else is helping you, your entity is gone. Now, it is, as I said, possible that some fragment might be somewhere else, but anything that was the whole is no longer whole. Acuity specifically deals with protecting against breakdown and fixation. Now, breakdown is a penalty that is definitely something that groups should discuss during session 0 and through continued gameplay, specifically because it can manifest itself in a myriad of different ways based off of what happened when they meet their maximum breakdown and what leads up to it. It is when the mind and the psyche itself is unable to handle what has happened to an entity, and it is not any specific underlying condition. It is not any sort of insanity chart or madness table or anything to that effect of, well, you're guaranteed to have this, and that says something about the world. It can be someone who has post-traumatic hydrate or dehydrate again. The room is quite warm. It can be a matter of post-traumatic stress disorder. It can be a matter of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. It can be a matter of any number of different things that cause that particular entity to have additional trouble when specific things happen. As that particular event is a trigger for that entity, it can be a matter of something like, say, a dog who happens to have been scared by fireworks that have been set off by a family from the loud noise that they produce, and noticing the shape of them before they are fired off, and having that happen enough that when they see it being set up, or that shape being brought into the home, that they immediately go and try to hide underneath a bed. Granted, a dog, after that particular event is over, is perfectly fine otherwise, but it is stressful to them in that particular instance. Breakdown, severity, and how it is played out is something that the group needs to decide upon for their own individual adventure. But that's essentially what it ends up being. Fixation, on the other hand, is both a blessing and a bane for entities. When you really want to knuckle down and get something done, fixation can help to prevent other distractions. It can help with maintaining abilities for a longer period of time than normal, or extending them despite being attacked or otherwise having individuals trying to distract. But on the other hand, when it fills up, it can be difficult to let go and do something other than what you've been fixating upon. If somebody has fixation forcefully increased, say, by a psionic entity, they might find themselves looping and doing the same tasks over and over again because they need somebody else to help them to snap out of it, or they need some other sort of impetus to change what situation is happening at that time. Now, all of these statistic adversity checks are what are rolled to prevent those particular penalties and hopefully prevent marks as well if the roll results well enough. An arbiter will, rather than rolling their own number or setting a specific DC or target number, will let the players know how much easier or difficult than normal the check is. If it is just a standard check, the player just rolls their regular dice for the check, and if it matches within the resolution ranges, then that is what the outcome is. If they are told that it's going to be more difficult, they can choose to roll it as is and have a number of disadvantages on a set number of dice based on how difficult it is. If they have a skill, using the optional skills mechanics, that may add a number of advantages based on the rank of that skill if it applies to that particular check. However, if they don't feel that they want to risk it, if they feel that they have not enough skill and there's too many disadvantages working against them, they may choose to utilize one of the meta currencies with the wager dice, specifically the different types of hedge dice. Hedges add to your luck in a particular check. They increase in size from luck dice to chance dice to fate dice. And when a check is called for, before the check is rolled, they can choose to look at how many advantages and disadvantages they have, knowing that one advantage and one disadvantage cancel each other out, but they can still have multiple of one or the other. Should they decide to utilize their luck dice, for example, they would roll that alongside the other ones before the resolution is declared, unless they have a trait that allows them to roll it later, which some may have. If they decide that they have a lot of skill in a particular task and they have a lot of advantages, they might choose to utilize one of their anti-dice, on the other hand, and reduce the outcome, because even with it reduced, they feel that it's not something that's going to be significant enough that they mind that reduction. It can be they are hunting for food, but they have plenty of coin, so if they manage to fail catching a deer out in the woods and they're near a town, they might not honestly care. But utilizing that anti-dice in such a fashion when it isn't as important can help them from it being forced upon them at a later point. Certain entities and situations may cause any anti-dice, or a certain number of them, to be applied when that arises. If you don't have any, if you've burned your jinx die, for example, then that helps you not to have as much of a problem when you go up against them. But it's a bit of trade, because you're choosing to have it be something that you're losing earlier. By losing it earlier, you're not facing it when it's a more deadly situation, at least, so that can be a good thing. But if you choose to use it at a moment when you actually did want to have a good outcome, and you overestimate how well you think you're going to do, that could potentially hurt the entity through application of a penalty, or simply by having something else happen that is a consequence of their choice. But that's entirely the point. They don't know what will happen in that particular regard, but it allows them to test things, see how well that they want to gamble on that particular check. Another hydration. Now, with the statistics discussed and the penalties discussed, we'll briefly move on to the attributes. Now, unlike statistics, attributes are when the entity is choosing to act upon the environment or other entities, or to improve their own skills and utilize other mechanics that aren't defensive in nature. The attributes themselves are strife, interaction, and traversal. Now, strife pretty much is understandable for what its function is. If somebody chooses to enter into combat with another entity, they're going to be utilizing strife for much of that particular combat. It can also be utilized if bashing down a door or if they are throwing something at a target. It can be utilized for any number of things which is meant to be more destructive in nature, more potentially intimidating. Uh, Interaction, on the other hand, is utilized usually with, if trying to solve puzzles, social interactions, um, taming animals, looking for information in books, and doing other research, assorted different uh, mechanics that aren't exploration or combat, largely being the social pillar. Traversal, on the other hand, is the third attribute, and traversal is utilized when moving through a space, through an environment. If, say, for example, pursuing after a target and they climb up the side of a building and run across rooftops that are at a slant, well, a traversal check would help get up onto the roof and begin chasing after them if that is uh, successful. And then, if entering into a crowd and a obstacle, say in many movies, a glass door panel is being carried across the street and comes between the entity and the target that they're pursuing. Moving around the glass panel would be traversal. Moving through it could be strife by breaking it to get through quickly, or jumping up onto the shoulders of an entity and leaping off of them to vault over the glass could also be traversal. Throwing something to on the floor, get the people out of the way, such as a scorpion that's in a pocket or something to that effect. Could be interaction or it could be strife. There are different ways of utilizing the different attributes in a trial check, unique to each individual situation. And as they are not limited to any specific set of skills, any skill that is applicable, if the skills mechanics are in use, can add to them. Parkour, for example, if used as a skill, could be used for climbing up onto the side of the building and onto the roof, but it also could be used when hopping off of the roof to land on the ground without taking as much damage and immediately roll into a kick against an enemy, which could be a mixture of traversal and strife in that particular case, utilizing traversal first to land as part of a movement action, and strife as part of the immediate attack action, but both would be modified by the skill rank in that particular case. With the FARAD system, there are a multitude of different ways that players can choose to face any particular challenge that they wish to go up against. They can choose to utilize any of the statistics for defense if it is something that isn't specified for what might be the outcome. Say exhaustion or strain when utilizing a stamina adversity check. Typically, the lesser of the two, whichever has fewer of the penalty, would be the one that has an increase unless the arbiter has stated which it is beforehand. However, should a player wish to add it onto the higher of their two that is protected by that particular statistic, they can choose to do so. This can be immersive. It can potentially be something that might aid them with other checks instead of having a higher amount of that penalty, because each of the penalties can create disadvantages for other checks. By keeping certain ones lower while allowing other ones to increase, it can help if you know you're going to be dealing with some of those other checks in a short period of time after that one has been failed. In which case, being able to make that choice can hurt if that penalty increases to its maximum, or in other instances where its effects are more disadvantageous. But it can help by choosing sometimes to mitigate what it is affecting through that choice. Now, typically, groups are not going to be intentionally choosing to fight amongst each other. However, there may be sometimes individuals who are mature enough to realize that what their entities do and what they do are separate things, and they can, for the sake of a dynamic plot, have conflict between their entities without bringing it outside of gameplay. Say, for example, one entity who has pickpocketed from the other to take something and tease them with it might make that secondary entity feel agitated and distrustful, even to the extent of wanting to fight against them. If that does occur, unlike with utilizing the statistics solely as defense and the attributes as affecting, the two aren't going against solely their own resolution states. They are going against each other's, in which case then the higher of the two would be either safe from repercussions if it is underneath a certain threshold, or taking on damages, penalties, if they happen to be the one that's being attacked and they fail. Rather than the standard resolution ranges, instead it would be by the value of a maximum value of a luck die or jinx die, as the resolution states themselves go up in increments based off that same amount. So it's able to be scaled similarly to deal multiple penalties, or a penalty and a mark, or none at all, based off of similar math. It's slightly different formula in that particular case in terms of addition and subtraction, but relatively easy, simple math that makes it so that it can be done quickly. So, the FARAD system itself is not specific in genre, tone, mood, or themes. It is meant to be adaptable for whatever a group wants to play. This can be a matter of choosing to play something that is medieval or Renaissance fantasy. It could be stonepunk, steampunk, dieselpunk, cyberpunk. It could be retrofuturism. It could be post-apocalyptic. It could be space opera, science fantasy, any sort of mixture that the group wants to play within. Different games have different tones that match those particular genres better, but even if they choose to utilize differences in how they play, the resolution states themselves remain. With any individual group, there may be some who prefer to play something that's a bit more lighthearted, but really enjoy the genre itself, and don't want to play something that is as punishing. And the rest of the group may be wanting to have that happen to their own characters more often. And as long as the group is perfectly alright with it, it is feasible to play that way, to have different resolution ranges per each individual entity, and still, because there's only 6 outcomes and it's not a single flat number of pass or fail, it's possible to play in that particular manner with each individual player having a different range. The math is using the same formula, but with different outcomes, percentages, and such that can affect how well it works for that individual player. Usually, I would recommend, in most cases, that after testing out the mechanics a little bit, a group finds a compromise that meets to what the majority wants to utilize. However, as many will attest, having played video games or board games, other tabletop games, party games, with younger audiences or older members of their family and friends who struggle with certain mechanics, they may sometimes not take advantage of nuances in the mechanics as much as they could. They may choose to allow home rules. They may choose to make things easier, such as, for example, when playing Smash Brothers Melee, limiting to no items. When playing against friends who know the game very well and play competitively, but when playing against, say, a younger sibling, leave the items on and just choose not to use them themselves if they want the challenge, while allowing that imbalance to aid their younger sibling because of the chaos that it can allow them to harness. In that particular fashion, the FARAD system does let this difference occur, but, as I said, that's up to each individual group to decide, and for the arbiter to keep track of for consistency. Should a group have an issue with that, an individual who is not liking the particular compromise and the others want them to have fun more than they care about the specific balance being the same amongst them, they may say, hey, let's just adjust what your ranges are. Everything else is based off of those, so it's easier to adapt than to just simply tell you to deal with it in order for you to have fun, so we all have fun. You don't like to play in that particular way, but you enjoy the dynamic plot. Let's adjust that. That is one of the core parts of the FARAD system that took me the longest to figure out how to build the rest of the system around. Originally, the FARAD system had been Myths and Legends, its first incarnation, which didn't last very long in its first edition before I moved it on to its second alpha, which still was Myths and Legends but restructured significantly. And then eventually some individuals who I knew from my workplace ended up playing in what was the second alpha when I decided to change its name to the FARAD system with discussion from them. They had played some sessions solo or with, with me and them as the only other player, or with only 2 players at a time. Just a matter of limited time and availability, distances from each other. And eventually, the second alpha ended, set it aside for a couple of years, and came back to it. I just adapted it into the third alpha. It's still more flexible, but not quite where I wanted it. And even after doing the third alpha and running 3 overlapping campaigns for a year and a half, and running part of a 4th unfinished campaign and multiple one-shots, issues with timing, scheduling, and other parts of life as people got older. The 3 players who I was playtesting the FARAD system with in its third alpha no longer were able to continue consistently enough. So I set it aside, was working on it here and there in the background, did a 5th edition campaign that eventually fizzled out, but started out with 8 players and slowly switched out some players and reduced the number until it wasn't able to continue. I ended up working on a series of novels, which are in their 5th draft for the first, and first draft for the second and third book. And eventually, the winter before the OGL scandal happened, I came upon how to finally get this particular core facet of the FARAD system reframed in my mind on how to build everything else around it and massively simplify while leaving room to expand upon the mechanics from what it had been in the third alpha to now where it is in the 4th alpha. Pretty much everything that could be done with it in the third alpha can be done in the 4th alpha, though not every mechanic has been updated to make it clear. However, there are over 270 pages in the core rulebook at present, and I'm concurrently working on that and streamlining parts of it that are the center mechanics that are going to be in the basic open licensable templates, which will be essentially the SRD system resource document equivalent for the FARAD system when it is released. That will take some time, obviously, because I still have to finish the 4th alpha itself and get that to a point where then I can go back through and put as many of the core templates into that without putting everything that's an optional mechanic or all the entries for different entities and things like that into it. My guess is that it will probably end up being around 150, 200 pages for the bolt, and for the core rules itself, it'll probably be closer to 300 or 400 pages. And that is without yet having much art to be putting into it, though leaving some gaps here and there for where to place some of it. For what will end up becoming the primary release for the FARAD system, and what will be publicly available for anybody else to build off of without having to ask permission for parts that are within the rest of the core rulebook. Because the bolt will be available for anyone, just like the SRD is, and just like other systems have their own resource document. That said, the stream has managed to have Bacon Gammon briefly at the beginning, and then needing to leave off for something. Appreciated his visit, and anybody else's who decides to watch this at a later point. The video itself is nearing my intended 1 hour mark, and I covered the majority of the topics that I would want to talk about without any pre-made questions or live chat questions to be asked. So the next time that I do another live stream, I will start moving on to additional mechanics and other aspects of the FARAD system. Things like how the FARAD system has mechanics for expending ammunition without having to track each individual one, potential damage to armor and other protective items, or choosing to use a tool or weapon in an improvised fashion and potentially break it from misuse, but still be able to potentially utilize it for what was desired, if, say, you're lacking what might be more suitable. There will also be some discussion in future live streams about some of the system agnostic settings that will be put out. They will include some of the mechanical elements of how to deal with the traits for the different lineages and other things. And traits is going to be probably multiple videos for how that is built upon the core. But for now, I will be signing off and leaving it at that for today. Again, I thank anybody who decides to watch this at some future point, and feel free to leave any comments, likes, subscribe if you're not. Anything that helps the algorithm with others finding this in the future will be beneficial. I'm not really marketing it at present very broadly, because it is more informal and building up things that people can view and hear about the FARAD system while they're still in flux through development of those documents. That said, have a good rest of the day.